Welcome to Politica, a podcast from the Jewish Independent which explains Israeli politics at a diaspora volume. I'm Sharon Offenberger, based in Australia, and joining me as always is my co-host Yuval Regev, coming to us from Israel. Our podcast Politica was in the works when the Iran war suddenly occurred, and so we actually started the podcast on day 11 of the war. We talked about Israeli support for the war and cautioned as to whether there was more of an emphasis on the tactics rather than the strategy. Today we'll talk about one of the key players at the table when it comes to the Middle East chess game. It's a tiny country which punches above its weight on the international stage. I'm not talking about Israel, I'm talking about Qatar, which is smaller in both size and population than Israel. For many Jewish Australians, Qatar is one of those names that comes up often, but usually without much explanation or understanding. It's somehow related to Hamas. There's Al Jazeera. They were involved in the hostage diplomacy, and they have global influence. So today we want to slow all of that down and unpack what Qatar actually is. Qatar was an Iran ally. It's hosted Hamas leaders and is behind the intra-Arab competition for regional leadership. It's definitely a rival to Israel, and yet Israel has simultaneously loathed it, courted it, and needed it. And it's implicated in a huge scandal within Netanyahu's closest circle, which we'll get to. But it also has a strategic allyship with the US. So in this war, whose side is it on? As it goes in the Middle East, the enemy of my enemy is my ally. But with Qatar, is the ally of my ally my enemy? Yuval, welcome and help us understand.
So shalom, Sharon, and shalom to our listeners. And what a topic we have for today, and specifically today, because just yesterday we saw an Iranian attack on Qatar's gas infrastructure. And that's, that's a big shift in the game. And we saw Qatar expelling Iranian diplomats. And so Qatar, as much as it's tried over, its history, not over just the past few years, to kind of play the game and be allies with everyone and be okay with everyone, they're being dragged into this conflict, and they have quite a dramatic role in what's going to happen. But I do want to set the ground kind of to understand why Qatar and understanding Qatar is so important to understanding Israeli politics over the past few years, and specifically some very, very major election issues, right? The Israeli voter is going to go to elections quite soon, and we know these are going to be the most dramatic elections, some say, in our history. Right? These are really fundamental elections. And Qatar is a key to understanding two election issues that I think probably are the main election issues for this cycle. And that is the first question of what happened on October 7th and how Israel was so blindsided, and how, look at Iran right now. Look at what the Israeli intelligence is doing. Look at what the Israeli Air Force is doing. We are this mighty military superpower with incredible achievements. So how did we miss October 7th? What's this intelligence scandal all about? And that's a question that Israelis, are deeply concerned about towards this election. And Qatar played a role in that narrative. And I think, we'll try to explain that in this episode. And then the second big question determining Israeli politics over the next few months is, specifically the question of Netanyahu as a figure and as a leader. And in that question also, Qatar has a huge role in the explosion of what we call Qatargate.
So Qatar and Israel have a really interesting history, because actually they had trade relations, and they even had an office in Doha until 2009, and was one of the Gaza wars in which it retracted that. But they've always had unofficial relations after. Qatar really enjoys diplomatic relations across the world. And if you remember the World Cup, that was really quite a pearl in the crown of Qatar's attempt to become part of a sort of west-east bridge. One of the things that Israelis will remember most about it is that they were allowed to enter. It was the first and maybe the only time they were allowed to enter en masse to Qatar.
Yeah, I remember that vividly. And I remember all the Israeli correspondents who were also allowed to broadcast the World Cup from Qatar. And this narrative was how accepted we are, how we feel the hospitality, how we feel like we're part of this neighborhood. I think that's what was so interesting about the Israel-Qatar relationship. And it also, there are back channels in the Israel-Qatar relationship, and there's also security relationships and intelligence relationships between the Israeli security apparatus and between Qatar.
And Qatar is obviously very much part of the Arab world and wrestles with some of the other countries for leadership. We tend to think of the Arab world as being quite homogenous and divided along sort of Sunni Shia lines. But I think that really simplifies quite a complex set of politics, economics, and also self-preservation of monarchies and autocratic leaders. Qatar doesn't really align itself with the other countries that Israel has been trying to align itself with, like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, even Egypt, and obviously the UAE. At some point, they actually cut diplomatic ties with Qatar and imposed a blockade on them for 4 years until 2021 because of Qatar's relationship and meddling with Iran.
Very true. And then we have to try to think about the Qatar perspective. A tiny nation, no military, huge resources. So what are they afraid of? They're afraid of some other superpower in the region coming in and and taking over. So their strategy has basically been to buy influence anywhere they can. And they buy influence in the West, and we see this, across academia and across real estate and sports and cultures, and they buy influence through aviation, and they buy influence in the region. That's what they do. That's the main strategic pillar of Qatar's existence. We buy influence. And by the way, let's just give a shout out to the anti-Semites who try to make claims about Jewish money and how Jews control the media, etc. Because Qatar has this unbelievable media machine called Al Jazeera, and they use it to influence, what they want to establish and the policies that they want to push forward. It's so interesting because, Qatar and Israel's relationship, there's this big debate over, are they an enemy or is it complicated? Those are kind of the two terms used. But Israel is in an all-out war with Qatar if we discuss the information war and the narrative war. And Qatar is pushing, so much of this anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic agenda throughout the West and throughout the Arab world. And we haven't really done much about it. And I have an example. 2-3 months back, when the ICE crisis was dominating American public interest, I saw this video by AJ Plus. Now, AJ Plus is kind of Al Jazeera's Gen Z millennial social media platform. And I saw this video on AJ Plus explaining how ICE has learned its tactics from the Israeli occupation machine in the West Bank. Okay, that was the video. That was the explainer. And I thought, how cynical. What a cynical move on American public opinion. What a way to link between what's, concerning young, woke audiences in the United States and between demonizing Israel. And I thought to myself, how many Americans who see this content, or how many Westerners who see this content, know that this is coming from Qatar, a country with absolutely zero human rights, especially when it comes to foreigners, a country where thousands of people were killed horrifically during the construction of the World Cup infrastructure, and they're pushing agenda on ICE. It's ridiculous.
So let's just talk a little bit about the sort of the bad faith side of what Qatar is doing. And you've mentioned Al Jazeera. What's interesting about Al Jazeera is, firstly, for our listeners to understand, Al Jazeera is Qatar government funded, and it was banned in 2024, and its offices in Israel and Ramallah were shut down. But prior to that, it's actually been banned in quite a few Arab countries. The fact that Al Jazeera has a very particular editorial line which riles up not only Israel and not only Jews, but a lot of the Arab world, is quite well known. But I did want to make a point, which I noticed when I worked in media in Israel and worked with international media, is that Al Jazeera also did something that didn't exist before, which was it covered and interviewed Israelis, which didn't happen in the Arab media and probably still doesn't happen in the Arab media. And to that extent, it did attempt to at least appear that it was bringing a balanced view. And, maybe that's where it falls under this dichotomy of, is it an enemy or is it complicated? And I think it's interesting that there is so much attention paid particularly to Al Jazeera and what it's doing in terms of the Qatari narrative. And yet we have something called Qatargate, which we will still come to, which is an even more obtuse example of how Qatar is infecting its narrative. And this is happening within the government. But I think we also can't escape the fact that one of the biggest issues in terms of Qatar's bad faith acts toward Israel is its hosting of Hamas and also its funding of Gaza, which over the years has come in with the permission of Israel. We're very aware of the suitcases of cash that were permitted to go through. They were intended for the Gazan public.
So that is the $1 million issue. Those suitcases of dollars of cash that have flowed from Qatar into Gaza, into Hamas for years. And I think we should explain this, and we should also explain why Israel was all for it, because it's an interesting story. And it's also a story very much on the ballot for this upcoming election. So we're talking about 2017, 2018. And by the way, this is exactly the years where Qatar was alienated by its neighbors in the Gulf. It completely correlates. And Qatar was looking for, a way to, again, buy influence, because that's what the Qataris do. And Israel was looking for a way to stabilize Gaza. And Gaza had, at the time, been in a rift. Hamas leadership in Gaza was in a rift with the Palestinian Authority leadership in the West Bank. And the Palestinian Authority leadership in the West Bank said to Gaza, we're going to stop paying all of your salaries. Right? Remember, Hamas is not just a terror organization, it's also the governor of Gaza. They have to pay salaries to teachers, to doctors, to bureaucrats, right? They control Gaza. And Gaza was on the verge of explosion with no money coming in. And Israeli security establishment was concerned in that sense. And that's when the idea was proposed, and nobody wants to take credit for this idea. Nobody says if it came from the Qataris or if it came from the Israelis or from the Americans. But the idea was proposed that Qatar would funnel money into the Gaza Strip and basically keep Hamas regime alive and keep Gaza alive. And that started happening with millions of dollars coming in suitcases in cash, okay? And why would the Israelis be okay with this? Right? We understand why what the Qatari interest is. The Qatari interest is buying influence in the Middle East, okay, and being held a position of a player and a mediator and a moderator. The security establishment was okay with this. Netanyahu signed off on this, right? It was to buy quiet from Hamas, and it was to buy stability. And I think when we ask ourselves what happened on October 7th and why we were so blindsided and why we couldn't see this attack coming despite, our incredible intelligence, that was the narrative. The narrative was that the Gazans and that the Hamas leadership, receiving all this money from Qatar, that they had something to lose.
Let's talk about Qatargate and why it is quite phenomenal in the political scene. Can you explain Qatargate to our audience?
Of course. So Qatargate, right up to this, current war with Iran, which is dominating, the headlines, obviously, because ballistic missiles are raining down on us. And it's scary. So we're very consumed with this issue of Iran. But up until then, Qatargate, for months, was the main headline issue on Israeli news and on the Israeli political cycle. And it's so dramatic because, again, we know Qatar buys influence. That's their strategy. We recently discovered, about a year ago, these things that started coming out, that Qatar was also buying influence in Israel. And within this scheme of Qatargate, it was found that Israeli journalists and media personnel were on the Qatar payroll in some way or another. And a few names, a few big names were included in that scandal and have since, been shut out of Israeli media. But it's not just that, because, those are personal private actors. It's also people on Netanyahu's very, very close media team, his very, very trusted media advisors. And the main name here is Yonatan Ulrich. Were also on the Qatar payroll, and specifically, allegedly, sorry, I have to say that, okay, and specifically, and this is so dramatic in Israeli eyes, because how is it possible that the people responsible for internal policies in Israel, for explaining the prime minister, for advising to him so closely, how is it possible that they were also in contact and running campaigns on behalf of Qatar during this horrific war?
The war and the hostage negotiations, which Qatar was deeply involved in.
Exactly. And Israel, some people on the Israeli political map are calling this the worst treason scandal in Israel's history. And that's quite big rhetoric.
And yet there are people in the political system that are trying to downplay this.
Of course, just as there are people who have, throughout the years, trying to downplay Netanyahu's trial with all the allegations against him. And again, so Netanyahu's hard support base see these allegations as fake news, see these allegations as, as exaggerated, and see kind of the Israeli media and whenever they attack it, or or the Israeli judicial establishment, whenever they attack or whenever they investigate something around Netanyahu, they see it as a witch hunt. So yes, some people are trying to downplay this, but the reason this is such a big ticket issue is because we have to remember the next election in Israel is not going to be a fight between the left and the right. The next election in Israel is going to be determined by who we call the soft right, people who are on the right wing or on the, this right-leaning center and who no longer want Netanyahu in charge.
But I have seen a Walla survey in December 2025, so only a few months ago, where 50% of Israelis considered this an act of treason, but only 17% of the coalition voters said that it would affect their vote.
Exactly. So we see, again, Likud voters are very strongly affiliated with Likud, and it's very hard to move people from Likud and out. And the other coalition partners who are to the right of the Likud, right, like Ben Gvir or like the Settlers, or of course the Haredim, are also very consistent voters. That's why, there's only very small margins of percentages of people on the what we call soft rights who are actually having a discussion in their head of whether they should vote for Netanyahu or whether they should vote for a different, more moderate right voice like Lieberman or Bennett or Eisenkot. And that's why Qatargate is so dramatic, because correlating with the terrible scandal of October 7th and correlating with this understanding that Israel was deeply, deeply played by Sinwar and by Hamas. Everyone bought this dumb narrative that Hamas was somehow okay with being bought off with Qatari money.
And I wanted to bring in something that people talk less about, which is how this is tied to Israel's democracy. So these advisors were not civil servants. Yonatan Ulrich is not a civil servant of the Israeli government. My understanding is that he doesn't even have security clearance. He's been paid by Likud, and the other actors who are involved in this scandal work for private firms. This means that the Prime Minister's closest advisors, acting as lobbyists for a foreign government, but not really having to declare that because they're not civil servants and they're not subject to those laws. And so I understand the legal cases against them are a little bit complicated because of that.
Precisely. There's a lot of gray here. In terms of the legal discussion. But in terms of the moral discussion, it's a lot more black and white, okay? It's, people who are attacking Netanyahu for this say to him, how could you? And he says, of course, he didn't know, okay? But people who know Netanyahu and who know the way that he, controls his people find that hard to believe. So the moral question is a lot bigger, I think, than the legal question here in terms of how can we handle the fact that the people who were in charge of mediating Netanyahu's policy to the Israeli public during our most historic, our most horrific, our most challenging war in our history were at the same time motivated by other motives. It's unbelievable. And so the caricatures coming out, which are a nice portrayal that have come out over the Qatargate explosion, which are a nice portrayal of what's happening, kind of reflects what we see caricatures in American public discourse. You have these caricatures of Trump being controlled like a puppet by Netanyahu. The same happens here. Netanyahu being controlled by a puppet by Qatari money and by the Qatari emir.
Part of what makes Qatar so difficult to understand specifically is that it sits in quite a moral grey zone, because on the one hand, it appeared to be helping in the hostage negotiations, and the hostage families were meeting with the Qataris when the Israeli government wouldn't meet with them. But at the same time, they empowered the organization that was holding the hostages. I know that I've found those hostage handover ceremonies that were fully coordinated with the Al Jazeera cameraman at the front. They was just stomach turning. But unlike some of Israel's other enemies, like Iran and Hamas, where it's a no-brainer to sort of get the Western support against them, with Qatar, this is not going to be the case. It has this allyship with the US. It has diplomatic relations across the board. And therefore, I think it is actually a very important actor that Israel needs to factor into its strategy. And maybe this war and the change in the relations with Iran will give an impetus to actually view it a little bit differently. I know a lot of people will call, and a lot of people in the media call Qatar the single biggest threat to Israel aside from Iran. But at the same time, it's not an enemy that can be confronted in the same way as Iran.
Correct.
So Qatar exposes something that's really uncomfortable at the heart of Israeli strategy, which is that influence rather than alignment, whose side are you on? Are you on our side? Are you with us or against us? Is really what matters. Israel has had this plan or dream of regional normalization, that it would make peace with these countries, none of which include the Palestinians. But Qatar is on the Palestinian side. I don't see how Israel could forge a regional normalization plan, including Qatar, that didn't include the Palestinians. And what's different about Qatar is it has its own relationship with the US, whereas some of the other countries want to make up with Israel as a way to improve their relations with the US, and Qatar isn't playing that game. And that's why, like a chess game, it's the queen. It has a lot of possible moves. And Qatargate just shows that Qatar really understands the strategy game better than many in Jerusalem would like to admit. But it also shows that Israel's own erosion of democratic safeguards has made it vulnerable to Qatar's influence. With Iran's position as the great regional rival clearly in decline, no matter what the outcome of this war is, I wonder if Qatar is going to step into that place. And sometimes I wonder if it isn't already there. While Israel is at war with Iran and mulling peace with Lebanon, I think that, like all chess games, you've got to keep your eye on the queen and see what Qatar's going to do.
And I'll just say, if Qatar is the queen, what does that make us? And is there room for more than one queen in the Middle East? So eyes on Qatar, eyes on the United States, eyes on Israel, and eyes on the whole neighborhood, because things are interesting.
This was Politica, Israeli politics explained at a diaspora volume. Please subscribe and follow us for more episodes. And until then, keep the volume down.